So this is really common, right? Like knights can move forward like this and attack your bishops when they're on these squares. And it's always a good idea to think through, what am I going to do if that happens? What's up, guys? Welcome back to the rating climb. Today we're looking at games I played against 1,200 to 1,400 rated players. Let's take a look. All right, so here we go. E4, E5. I played bishop C4 going for the Yurosov gambit again, and we did get a chance to do that after knight F6. Now, opponent played the move D5, which is very aggressive, very, just countering what I'm trying to do right away. I don't know that it's necessarily good. And one of the things, when you get into a position like this, you pretty much kind of just have to calculate a bunch of captures and see what's going to happen and what's going to lead to the best outcome. So at this point, I'm thinking, wait, if I take here, what's going to happen if black takes here and then I take here? What if I take here first and black takes my bishop and I take the knight? What if I don't take anything and just move my bishop? Does that make sense? Probably not, because then black's going to have, I'm going to waste the tempo. It doesn't really make sense. And so basically what I decided on was a way to make a trade that would leave black with a bad pawn structure. And so I noticed that if I took here, I'm threatening the knight. And if the knight moves, let's say like captures here, well, then this pawn's going to be free for the taking. So that doesn't make sense for black, which means they pretty much have to take my bishop in this position. Also, moving the knight anywhere else doesn't make sense for the same reason. I'm just going to take. So I saw that they would have to take here. I saw that I could take the knight, but also trade queens first. So that's what I did. I traded the queens, took the knight, and then after they recaptured, I noticed that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I also have 7 pawns, but look at mine. Look how nice and pretty my pawn structure is, right? Compared to black's. We've got double isolated, we've got isolated, and then we have doubled pawns here. So I knew that long term, black's going to have all these weaknesses to deal with. Even though other than that, the position's pretty equal, I really like the fact that I have that advantage. And looking at Stockfish over here, it says plus 1.25. So it's giving me almost a pawn advantage, and it's just based off this, right? Just the bad pawn structure that black has. So as soon as I saw that that was pretty much a forcing line, I went ahead and traded off the pawns that way. That's kind of what you want to be looking for when you get into these positions where there's a lot of tension. You want to look for a forcing line that gives you some kind of advantage, right? And in this case, that's, what I saw. So that's what we did. I played bishop f4. I just wanted to develop these two pieces quickly and get castled so that my rook can be involved with tempo in the game. This seemed like the best diagonal for my bishop. And so that's what I did. All right, bishop g7, knight c3, following through with the plan, just developing those pieces. And then I did castle, just like I mentioned, with check, so I'm gaining a tempo there. Bishop to d7. And now I decided to develop the knight here instead of f3 because it looked like maybe bishop c6 was going to happen. There's going to be some pressure here. And I wanted to be able to play f3 and just shut that down. And also, most likely, this knight is probably going to head to d4. On f3, I can go to d4, but I can also go there from here. And on f3, this pawn on f6 is kind of dominating the knight where I can't go there. So it looked like this gave me more options, right? I can also go over here and hop into these squares. Still, I can go to d4, and I'm get the bonus that I'm defending both of these pieces in case that would be useful at some point. So in this case, this was kind of an exception to the rule. Normally, the knights are better on these two squares, but in this case, I really felt like e2 was just slightly better. So knight e2, knight c6, and then I did play f3, just kind of solidifying, defending these squares. And then we get king c8, so he's trying to get out of the pin, which makes sense. And now I did bring the knight in, like I mentioned. We get the trade, and then b5. All right, now at this point, I was actually getting a little bit concerned that a move like f5 could be pretty strong for black because they've got these pawns. This could be happening. And if a move like f5 gets played, so for example, let's just say I kind of wasted a move with like h3. If f5 happens, well, now I have to move my rook back somewhere. Let's say I go back here. Now black can trade here, or actually take here first, mess up my pawn structure, then trade here. Notice how the rook's coming in. And this doesn't look like a good position for me anymore. My pawn structure is messed up. Black's rook is pretty active. These pawns are very annoying. Not what I wanted to go for, right? Now, I did waste a move in this case, but it was important that I had a plan here. So I decided to bring this rook over because that's going to buy me some time because I'm attacking the bishop. And I was expecting black to do something like bishop c6, and I still have to kind of figure out how I'm dealing with f5. And my plan was actually to drop the rook back, because now if black plays f5, it's not with a tempo on my rook, so I can at least take here. Yes, I'm still going to get messed up pawn structure, and we still have an opposite color bishop endgame, but at least I get an extra pawn, and now I have 4 against 2 over here. So it didn't seem like a great solution, but that's all that I saw at the time, and so that was kind of going to be what I was planning. Now, luckily for me, opponent played a5, didn't have to even worry about that. They just didn't see that the bishop was hanging, and so I just won the bishop. But if they would have played bishop c6, it would have been a much more interesting game. And Stockfish is actually telling me a4 was the move to play, which is interesting because I was still going to be worried about f5, and so I just want to see what it says. Take here, sacrifice the exchange, then take here, and then after the bishop moves, you take this pawn, I guess? Interesting. So basically, Stockfish is saying giving up the rook makes sense there because I'm going to get a bunch of pawns for it. And yeah, this is just better for white. So that's a resource that I did not find. But like I said, black didn't see the bishop, and it just didn't really matter. We played some more moves, but it's pretty much over. I was just setting up rook takes c6 is checkmate, and black tried to prevent that, but they fell for this checkmate. So that's the game. Pretty straightforward there. Unfortunately, black blundered the bishop, so we didn't get to see any more. Let's go ahead and look at the next game. All right, so here we go, white, and we have another Scandinavian. So I decided to take. Again, I was going to go for this b4 line, and that's what I played. Queen to b6. So opponent did not go for it, which is too bad. I wanted to play knight b5 and go for that trap, but I decided let's just continue developing and not overthink it. And now here's a very instructive moment. So bishop to g4, there should be a move that immediately jumps out at you when you see this. And so I would like you guys to pause and think through, what do you think I played here and why? All right, well, if you're ready to see the solution, the move that I played here was bishop takes f7 check. And this is a very common tactic. When there's a bishop on g4 lined up with your queen like this, and you have your bishop that can take on f7, you always have to consider, can you take and then follow through with one of these 2 knight checks? And it's not always the same. Sometimes one is better than the other. Like, for example, after takes, king takes. In this case, knight g5 is a bad move because the king just moves and I can't take the bishop. It's defended by the knight, right? So in this case, I have to play knight e5 check because it forks both of these. And after the king moves, well, now I can take it with my knight and I'm getting my piece back. But sometimes, for example, like if this knight would have been back and this knight would have been on c6, this would be the wrong move, because then this knight's going to take me and defend the bishop. And in that case, if, like I said, if this is back here and this is up here, then knight g5 would be the correct one. So you have to look at the position. It depends. And sometimes, I should mention, it's even better to, instead of taking right away, you bring your knight in, allow your queen to get captured, and it actually can lead to checkmate. There's some traps. If you imagine if black's queen was on d8, that could be an example. Knight e5, allow my queen, and then that would be checkmate, right? In this case, it doesn't work because the king can escape, but those are the things you want to be thinking about. And so as soon as I saw bishop g4, I'm like, wait a second. And then I had to, calculate a little bit to make sure that it works, because depending on the position, sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, it was fine. So knight e5. And basically, I got my piece back. I won the pawn on f7. And more importantly, black loses castling rights. And so that's the most important thing about that trade. So knight goes here. I decided to just castle. We get e6, a3. Before I was okay with black taking that pawn with the queen because I was going to be able to kind of harass it with my rook. But now the bishop could have taken it. And if the bishop takes it, it's not quite as easy. Yes, I can still go there and get a pin, but black's going to have time to move the queen and then probably move the bishop. And I just was like, you know what? Let me just go ahead and defend it now, since I didn't really see any other moves jumping out at me. So c6, d3. I just wanted to give myself options for this bishop. Maybe I'm going to go to e3 with tempo on the queen. Maybe f4, maybe even g5. King f7. Not a big fan of that move because it brings it closer to where I can attack it. So if you want to pause and think through, what's a way that I can use my pieces to take advantage of the fact that the king is now more exposed? Well, if you said knight to e4, you are correct. Basically, I'm just bringing the knight in so that now I'm threatening to go to g5, which is pretty dangerous for black. Also eyeing this square. Now it is defended, but like I said, if I could get my bishop on f4, then, you know, knight d6 could be an option as well. So knight e4, just kind of bringing the piece that wasn't really doing too much to a more active square where I can threaten the king. Rook to d8, and I did go for knight to g5. Now, the annoying thing about this move is that the king would really like to go back probably to g8, where it's more protected. But if it does, then this pawn on e6 is going to be undefended. The only way the king can defend it is to go to e7, which was played in the game, but now this is really not where the king needs to be. It's blocking the bishop, which is a big deal, because the bishop is stuck, which means the rook is stuck, which means these pieces are completely out of the game, and the king is still pretty exposed, right? There's a nice target here on e6. So I played rook e1, just lining up, getting ready to capture that, bringing another piece into the game. And here my opponent just resigned. There's really not much that they can do to defend this, and so, you know, it's pretty much over at this point. Of course, they could have played on a little bit longer, but it's not a great position. So let's go ahead and jump into the next game. All right, and here's the next game. I was actually white on this one as well. So e4. I decided to go for a Danish gambit in this one. So d4, c3. I was hoping black was going to take. I was going to play bishop c4, get some very aggressive positions. They decided to decline the gambit with d6, which isn't really great for black because now I can just recapture and I have two pawns in the center. I've basically traded this c pawn for this e7 pawn, and so I have more central control, so I'm happy with that. Knight f6, knight c3, just developing my knight to the best square. Bishop e7, bishop d3. Now, sometimes I like to put the bishop on c4 because of the potential tactics along here with f7. The reason I didn't in this example is because if I play bishop c4, it looked like black was just going to castle. And once black gets castled, the tactics on f7 usually go away for the most part, because now you can't force the king to take like you could before. Now there's always rook takes. And if the rook can take, usually there's not going to be a really good follow-up because you're giving up your bishop on that diagonal, and then the rook captures. Even if I could bring in a knight or something, the rook's just going to move away. I don't actually get to the king. So because of that, I could see that black was going to castle next move, right? I can't stop that. I said, okay, bishop to d3 looks like after the king castles is going to be the more important diagonal for this bishop to be on, right? And so we're going to see later in the game how that actually kind of did happen. So, but just showing how you want to plan ahead for which diagonal is really going to be the most effective. So bishop d3 castles, knight to e2. I could have went knight f3. It just looked very obvious, like the bishop could go to g4 and that'd be a nice square for the bishop. This way, it's kind of like I don't really know how black's going to develop this bishop. It can't go here. If it goes here now, I'm going to play f3 and chase it away and get a nice attack going. If it goes to e6, I've got d5. d7 is a pretty passive square for the bishop, and so I felt like putting my knight here was a good way to hinder what black was going to do here. Also, I was thinking about castling, and maybe I could play f4, f5, e5, you know, use this f-pawn to attack. And so also I could bring the knight over here and you know, relocate it that way. So that's why I chose there. Castled, bishop to e3, knight c6. Now, I want to mention something. When I played bishop e3, I was thinking about knight to g4. And then here, after knight c6, I was thinking about knight to b4. So this is really common, right? Like knights can move forward like this and attack your bishops when they're on these squares. And it's always a good idea to think through, what am I going to do if that happens? So going back here, my plan on bishop e3 was if black did play this, I was going to allow that to happen. I wasn't going to worry about it. I was probably going to play just a developing move like rook c1. Let this happen and then use this to my advantage to attack. You also get an extra pawn in the center that kind of helps support the center. And, you know, sometimes you have to be careful. This could become a weakness, right? Bishop g5, I have to watch out for that. But I saw that I had my queen. I could use my knight if I needed to. And I felt like the half-open file was going to give me good opportunities to attack. And the fact that black had to waste some time to do that, I was going to get this move in for free, get some more pressure there. So that's what I was thinking if knight g4 would have happened. It didn't. And now here, again, I was asking myself the question, okay, what am I going to do on knight to b4? How am I going to, you know, deal with this threat on my bishop, right? Because you don't usually want to just give up the bishop for the knight unless you get some sort of compensation. So I played rook c1, and I had a plan for knight to b4, and that's exactly what happened in the game. My plan was that I wanted to bring the bishop back to b1. Now, it's important. It's really important that I played rook c1 first, because if you imagine, let's just say I played a different move, like got out queen d2, knight comes in, and now I bring the bishop back. Look at how my rook is trapped in the corner. This is not at all what you want, because my rook is not going to be able to do anything unless I move the bishop. And where am I going to move the bishop to? Not what you want. It's a huge difference going back to the game, rook c1. Now, my bishop is still effective along the diagonal that I want it to be on, and I'm not trapping my rook. My rook is also effective on this file where I want it. So keep that in mind. If you are going to plan on putting your bishop back here like this, just make sure you get the rook out of the corner first, and then you'll be fine. So b6, now I just kicked the knight away with tempo because my bishop is controlling everything. It can't do anything. It has to go back. So knight there, and queen to c2. Now, this I feel like was a really strong move because I'm setting up multiple threats in the future. So right now I'm not threatening anything immediately, but what I am doing, although that's not entirely true, but basically what I'm doing is lining up for checkmate over here at some point, if I can get this knight to move. And I'm also lining up on this knight. So I'm creating these double threats at the same time, which is very difficult for black to deal with, okay? So they played knight to g4, kind of going on the offensive, but it does open up a potential checkmate here. Now, this is actually a very tricky moment in the game because I have a lot of options. And whenever you have a position like this where you have a lot of options, usually you want to spend a good amount of time. So for example, knight to d5 was a move I was considering because it unleashes this attack, like I mentioned, on the knight. Also puts pressure here if the knight moved. So that looked pretty good. But I also was thinking I really would want to threaten checkmate too with e5. And then I'm thinking, well, I also could just play something like h3, allow this to capture first and just kind of wait. So most of my thought process was around, if I play e5, how is black going to prevent this checkmate, right? And there's f5, but then I was looking at en passant, the knight could recapture, then I could bring my knight to d5, that looked pretty good. There's also g6, and I had to decide, do I like that position better, or is knight to d5 better? I actually wasn't sure. I decided to go with e5 because it looked pretty forcing, like it was going to force black to make some weaknesses, and I just felt like that was the best way to go. It turns out I was wrong. Stockfish's knight d5 was the best choice, but when I was playing the game, I couldn't decide, so I played e5. g6, so they did stop the checkmate. And now I played a move which I saw would force some trades that would lead to a position that I was okay with. Again, Stockfish is really liking this knight to d5 move, and it just goes to show that like sometimes the most obvious moves are better than these like really complicated plans that we might come up with, right? Like if I would just play the logical looking move, knight d5, it's very, very obvious move, right? Put the knight in the center, you're attacking a bunch of stuff, you're threatening the knight. I mean, it makes a lot of sense why that would be a really good move, right? Instead, I was like, no, I'm going to play this crazy looking e6 move because, of course, if the pawn takes here, it allows me to get checkmate. So that's one idea. And then the other point was that after queen takes, which is what they played, I was going to, well, before I talk about that, I wanted to play d5 and fork these pieces. That was my initial idea. But then I realized that if I play there, black can actually take on e3, threaten my queen. So even though I can take black's queen, they're going to take me. Yes, I can throw in this check, and we get this trade, which I mean, it looks pretty equal, right? It looks like a pretty equal position. 3, 4, 5, 3. I'm actually down a pawn. And so, yeah, not really what I want to go for. So I noticed at this point that I could throw in this move here. Instead of d5, I could throw in this move, bishop takes h6. And the point is that I'm not allowing black to capture and force that queen trade. Yes, I'm going to lose my bishop over here, but then I'm going to get my piece back. And black's king is a bit more exposed. So that was my idea. I played d5, and then I took the knight. So it was kind of a big trade, and it's okay for me, but going back to the other position when Stockfish was recommending knight to d5, now we can kind of see why that was probably better, right? Because this is just a relatively equal position, and I actually kind of simplified away some of my advantage. So that's something to keep in mind. So now black's going on the offensive, obviously threatening checkmate here. Played knight to g3. One of the things about a position like this, I could have played g3 to defend that, but why did I choose to play knight to g3 instead of g3? This is an important question. So think through, what do you think the reason is? Well, for those of you who have followed the channel, you know that whenever you move a pawn in front of your king, you create weaknesses. So when I played g3, guess what? All of these squares just became much weaker. this bishop can at some point come over here, or maybe if this pawn gets captured, it can just come here. And I'm never going to be able to cover these squares the same way, right? And so you really want to try not to do that if you have another option. I did have another option, knight to g3, and so that's why I chose this one. It also opens up this so that now I can potentially go here with my rook. So knight to g3, bishop to h4, and then I did bring the rook over with tempo, just trying to activate a piece that wasn't really doing too much. Queen goes back to f6. Of course, there's an attack here, but it's already defended by my queen, so I wasn't worried about that. And now I finally brought the knight to d5, which has some really nice threats. All right, so queen to d4, and I just said, you know what, let's go ahead and bring this rook over. It's with tempo, it defends my knight, it attacks the queen, and I still have this attack on c2. So, you know, you want to always be scanning in positions like this to make sure everything's defended. There is an attack here, but I noticed my queen was defending it, so I'm okay. I'm not worried about this. And then, of course, like I said, the knight was undefended. I wanted to defend it. All right, so the queen goes back here. I just took the pawn. My queen's defended. I'm fine if black wants to trade. I'm going to have this past c-pawn now. So bishop to f5. They decided to sack the rook. So I said, okay, let's just trade queens. I threw in this trade first, just because why not simplify? And then I took the rook. All right, so f4, so black's trying to force the knight to move, and they have this little attack here. Stockfish had a really nice move that I didn't consider, rook to e4. The idea is that if they take now, you've got this fork, and you're actually winning 2 pieces, which is pretty interesting. And on f5, you can actually just take here and just take the pawn that was attacking your knight. So that was a really interesting idea. I didn't see that, so I decided to just play knight e4 because it defends it as well. And I saw that if my knight got attacked, I'd be able to throw in g3 and force a trade. Not as good as Stockfish's idea, but it was good enough. So I went ahead and played g3, just shutting down the pressure on the f2 pawn, traded that off, took the pawn, you know, just going for pieces that are undefended. Brought the rook to the 7th rank, always a good place for the rook. Also, it's setting up to play c7 and rook down here. And I should have just went with the plan that I initially was going for, because this is just the best and quickest way to win the game. The reason I played f3 is because I noticed that the knight was trapped. So it can't go here, it can't go here, it can't go here, it can't go here. All of these squares are covered by my pieces, right? See that? And so I was like, oh, I'll just go here and win the rook. But of course, if you can, you know, force a queen and win a rook, it's better than winning a knight. So I don't know why I did that. But anyway, f3, the king is trying to obviously do something there. I just wanted to keep the knight trapped. And there we go. I took the knight. And we played a few more moves, but it's basically over. There's the checkmate. So I could have done that a little bit faster. But a couple big takeaways from that game. I'm going back. Remember, just make sure you have a good plan for if the knights hop into these squares. It's pretty common, especially at this rating range. Lots of players like to do that and go for your bishops. And so just come up with a good plan. In this case, I had this idea of creating these batteries, which turned out to be really strong. Messed it up a little bit, you know, by not playing knight d5 when I should have. But overall, I think it was a pretty good game. And then also, you know, these critical moments like right here are super important. This is where a lot of games are won and lost. And I even misplayed it. And so just going with the obvious move of putting a piece in the center, creating a threat, sometimes is just better than trying to go for some fancy stuff that may or may not work. But anyway, hope you guys learned something from that, and I'll see you in the next one.